It's time again for another installment of the basics, and just late last night I built another deck for the Star Trek CCG. In this case it was a brand spanking new Dominion deck because I haven't done one in a while. And it got me thinking, and I want to show you how I go about constructing a deck. I have several stages of deck construction in this game, and I'm going to use my Dominion deck as well as my Federation deck as examples to show you my manner of thinking in this case. So let's do this. So the obvious first step to deck construction, this should go with how anyone makes their decks, is choosing an affiliation. And when I started building this deck last night, I had originally chosen Cardassians because it's also been a while since I've done a Cardassian deck. But then I realized I have way more personnel and way better equipment with the Dominion than I do with the Cardassian. So the first step after choosing your affiliation is going through the personnel in your affiliation and making sure you have a lot of varied attributes, classes of personnel, and skills. This is integral because once you see how many personnel you have and what their classifications and skills are, that leads you, or at least me in this case, to construct the mission set or the space line for this deck. And those missions are tailored around my personnel to a certain extent, as well as the affiliation as a whole. Now, because this is a Dominion deck, 1 out of the 6 missions is located in the Gamma Quadrant to start me off, because most of my personnel and ships are Gamma Quadrant. So I do have in the seed deck as well the Bajoran wormhole to get me into the Alpha Quadrant. I also have 2 outposts, one for the Gamma Quadrant and one that I can build later in the Alpha Quadrant once I come through the wormhole and start going through that part of the space line. The next phase is ships, because once your personnel and your missions and your outposts are set, you need ships, because that's going to get you down the space line. I can't show you my selection of ships. I'll just tell you there's 4, and they are quite good, and they are varied. They're specifically varied for the types of personnel that I have in this deck, which are not just Jem'Hadar, because that would be foolish. Once I've done the personnel and ships and all that, I move on to the equipment, because your personnel need equipment, especially if there's away missions or anything like that, and you need to be able to swap out some skills here and there. The problem with the Dominion, though, right off the bat, is you need a lot of Ketracel White equipment cards in your deck. Otherwise, you're going to have problems. So that takes up a significant chunk of equipment in this deck, and the reason why this deck is a bit larger than most. From there, I go to dilemmas, and I pick out a certain number of dilemmas between 18 and 25, possibly more, but 18 and 25 is a happy medium to be put in the seed phase under my opponent's missions. Once the dilemmas are completed, and I choose them in terms of nastiness and how many attributes or skills you actually need to get past them, because the more things and requirements needed for a dilemma, the harder it is for your opponent. And once that's done, I go on to the bulk of the deck, which is every other type of card, from doorways to artifacts, interrupts, events, and power cards. Now, this deck was not built with a side deck. This deck is a standalone deck. It's not meant to have a side deck. My Federation deck, however, is built differently. And this deck I've had for a long time, but I've just kept adding and subtracting. When I built this deck originally, I followed almost the same steps as I did with my Dominion deck and the way I do decks now, except I was concurrently building this deck along with the side deck. Because not only do you need power cards and your good assortment of every other card in your draw deck, if you're planning on playing with the Q side deck, you have to carefully plan out what's going to be in that side deck and how you're going to need them throughout the game. I'm not going to go into huge detail with that, but when you're building a deck that contains a side deck, it's like building 2 decks at once. Now, I've been asked over and over throughout the years and how long it takes me to build a deck. The Dominion deck I built last night took me about 1 hour and 15 minutes, which is a bit long by my standards because I can normally build a pretty decent deck in well under an hour. But because it's Dominion and because I had to find some of my equipment cards and I had to tailor the missions and other things, it took a bit longer. There's no right or wrong for how long it can take to build a deck. I used to play with a group of friends where some guys were able to put together a deck in 15 minutes, and some of us took the night before to build a similar type of deck for gameplay. So there's no rule of thumb for how long it takes to build a deck. You know when your deck is complete and ready to play. That's all for today. Have a great day, everybody.